To understand why Sakhagarh became one of the finest and fiercest armored battles since the Second World War, one must abandon the habit of viewing geography as backdrop. In Sakhagarh, geography was not scenery, it was an active force that shaped decisions, punished errors, rewarded discipline. Tanks didn't merely fight each other there, they fought rivers, soil, fog, distance, and time. The Sakhagarh Bulge was not a living tactical organism, and those who misunderstood it paid in burning steel. The Sakhagarh Bulge lay in Pakistan's Sialkot sector, protruding eastward into Indian territory like a clenched fist. Bounded roughly by the Ravi River on the south and the Chenab River on the north, it formed a salient that was both tempting and dangerous. On maps, it appeared as an opportunity for maneuver. On the ground, it revealed itself as a labyrinth of natural obstacles. The very feature that made it defensible also made it vulnerable if breached. This duality is what transformed Sakhagarh from a defensive bastion into a killing ground. Unlike the desert theatres of Lonjewala or the canal-dominated sectors of Fazilka, Sakhagarh's terrain was deceptive. At first glance, it was a classic tank country: flat, open farmland, low vegetation in winter, and long sight lines ideal for gunnery. And beneath this apparent openness lay a web of rivers, tributaries, and seasonal streams and irrigation channels. The Basantar River, the most decisive of these, was not a grand waterway but a modest river that became lethal through this context. Its banks were soft, its approaches narrow, its crossings few. For tanks, it was not width that mattered, but footing. A tank that lost traction near Basantar was not merely slowed, it was immobilized and exposed. Winter amplified every geographical feature. December in Punjab brings fog that reduces visibility to tens of meters, especially in the early morning and late night. This fog neutralized long range gunnery advantages and forced armored engagements in brutal proximity. Tanks that in doctrine were meant to fight at ranges of 2 kilometers found themselves firing at a few hundred meters, sometimes less. In such conditions, crew training, reaction time, coordination mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. Sakhagarh turned theoretical superiority into relevance. The soil itself became a weapon. The fields of the bulge were cultivated land, churned seasonally by agriculture, softened by winter moisture. Under the weight of 40 tanks, the soil collapsed unpredictably. Tanks could bog down without warning, especially when attempting off-road maneuvers to bypass minefields or avoid obvious crossing points. Pakistani planners had counted on prepared defensive belts and predictable Indian avenues of approach. Indian planners, however, exploited the very unpredictability of the terrain, advancing slowly, methodically, and with engineering support that transformed hostility ground into navigatable corridors. Minefields were the man-made extension of geography. Pakistan laid extensive minefields across likely Indian approaches, often integrated with nalas and streams to lay layered obstacles. These were not mere delaying devices, they were intended to canalize Indian armour into killing zones where Pakistani tanks could engage from prepared hull-down positions. The assumption was simple: slow the attacker, expose him, destroy him. But this assumption underestimated the Indian emphasis on engineers and combined arms. Indian sappers cleared minefields under fire, sometimes over multiple nights, creating narrow lanes that allowed tanks and infantry to cross where Pakistani defenders believed movement impossible. In Sakhagarh, the ability to move became more decisive than the ability to shoot. The rivers of the Bulge dictated tempo. The Ravi and Chenab framed the theatre strategically, but it was the smaller rivers and nalas that decided the battles tactically. Each crossing was a commitment. Once tanks crossed, Withdrawals became difficult, especially under fire. Pakistani doctrine envisioned counterattacks that could smash Indian bridgeheads before they could be reinforced. Indian doctrine, refined since 1965, aimed to smash bridgeheads that could be easily erased, supported by artillery and infantry, then absorb counterattacks until the attacker exhausted himself. The Basantar River became the crucible of this context. Visibility was another silent combatant. Fog and smoke collapsed the battlefield into fragments. Commanders often fought with incomplete information, relying on radio reports distorted by fear, confusion, and technical limitations. Tanks advanced into contact without clear knowledge of enemy strength or disposition. In such an environment, pre war planning mattered less than adaptability. Crews that hesitated died, crews that trusted drills survived. Sakhagarh punished rigid thinking and rewarded decentralized initiative within disciplined frameworks. The Bulge also imposed psychological strain. Unlike desert battles, where space offers psychological breathing room, Sakhagarh compressed action into narrow corridors. Crew often knew that every crossing, every cleared range was likely observed, targeted, and contested. The constant presence of water, obstacles, and minefields created a sense of entrapment. Once committed, there was no easy retreat. The pressure magnified fatigue, fear, and the consequences of leadership failure. It also elevated acts of individual courage into decisive factors, as moments of hesitation or resolve could determine what a bridgehead lived or died. From a broader operational perspective, Sakhagarh inverted traditional expectations of armored warfare. Instead of sweeping maneuvers and deep penetration, it produced grinding, attritional tank battles fought over limited grounds. Instead of speed, it demanded patience. Instead of technological dominance, it rewarded integration. Tanks couldn't operate alone, they required infantry to protect against close threats, artillery to suppress enemy positions, engineers to create mobility, and air defenses to deter interference. Sakhagarh was not a playground for armored pursuits, it was a test of modern combined arms warfare under subcontinental conditions. For Pakistan, the Bulge represented both shield and sword. Losing it would expose Sialkot and weaken the defense coherence of Punjab. For India, neutralizing it meant removing Pakistan's ability to launch meaningful armored offensive on the Western Front. Geography made compromise impossible. One side would have to impose its logic on the terrain or be crushed by it. By the time major armored engagements erupted around the Basantar Bulge, the outcome was already being shaped by how each army had interpreted the land beneath its tracks. Pakistan trusted prepared positions and offensive counterattacks. India trusted slow, methodical penetration and the ability to endure punishment while tightening its grip. Sakhagarh didn't favor brilliance in isolation, it favored systems that could function under friction. In this sense, the Sakhagarh Bulge was more than a battlefield, it was a filter through which doctrines passed and were either validated or destroyed. It stripped armor warfare of illusion and reduced it to essentials movement, coordination, will under constraint. The tanks that burnt were not victims of enemy fire alone, they were casualties of misreading the ground. With the terrain defined and the logic of the battlefield exposed, the stage was set for the forces that would collide upon it. For the next part turns to the men, machines, and formations that carried their doctrines into this unforgiving landscape. Part 3 Order of Battle Indian 11 Corps versus Pakistan's 1st Corps. Wars are often narrated as clashes of nations, but battles are decided by formation, commanders, and the systems of command. At Sakhagarh, the opposing armies didn't meet as abstract entities called India and Pakistan. They met as two corps level machines. Indian 11 Corps and Pakistan's 1st Corps, each shaped by the institutional culture, its past failures, its expectations of the coming fight. The Battle of Shakargarh wasn't merely an armor duel, it was a confrontation between two philosophies of how modern war should be organized, commanded, and sustained. Indian 11 Corps was tasked with one of the most complex missions on the Western Front. It had to advance into a heavily defended salient across multiple water obstacles, observe inevitable counterattacks, and or do so without jeopardizing India's primary strategic objective in the east. This demanded restraint as much as aggression. 11 Corps was not expected to race for spectacular breakthroughs. It was expected to grind, hold, and deny. Its composition reflected this mandate. The 11 Corps combined infantry divisions trained for deliberate assaults with armored elements integrated at multiple levels. Supported by substantial artillery and engineering assaults, the emphasis was on balance rather than shock. At the core of 11 Corps efforts were infantry divisions such as 54 Infantry Division and the 36th Division. Formations with experience in Punjab terrain and a tradition of methodical advance, 3 divisions were not glamorous. They were disciplined, well drilled, and capable of operating under heavy fire for extended periods. Their role was to secure ground, protect engineers, hold bridgeheads against counterattack. Armour didn't lead blindly, it followed infantry that had created the conditions for this movement. The armored component of 11 Corps was drawn primarily from the 2nd Independent Armoured Brigade and the attached armoured regiments. Indian armoured doctrine in 1971 had evolved significantly since 1965. Gone was the overconfidence that tanks alone could dominate. In its place was a sober understanding that armour was powerful only when integrated. Indian regiments operated a mix of Vijayantha tanks derived from the British Vickers design and the Soviet origin T-55s. The Vijayantha, though often dismissed by critics as inferior to the Patton on paper, proved well suited to Indian doctrine. It was reliable, easier to maintain, and its crews were extensively trained in gunnery and coordination. The T-55 added a different dimension with a lower profile, better armor shaping, and a potent main gun. Indian artillery, often the silent arbitrator of the battle, played a role decisive enough that the 11 Corps possessed substantial artillery assets capable of delivering sustained fire across river lines onto enemy assembly areas. Artillery wasn't used merely for preparatory barrages, but as an active participant in the battle, breaking up counterattacks, suppressing enemy guns, isolating Pakistani armored thrusts. Indian gunners had learned from the 1965 that artillery was not adjacent but a backbone at Sakhagarh. They operated with precision and patience. Equally critical were the engineers. Indian engineering units were integrated deeply into the core plan. Their mission wasn't limited to bridge building. They were combat elements tasked with mine clearance, river crossing, and the creation of mobility under fire. In many cases, the engineers worked at night under shelling, cutting lanes through minefields, and preparing crossings that would allow armor to surge forward at dawn. Without them, 11 Corps would have stalled at the first obstacle. With them, it could impose its tempo on the battlefield. Opposing 11 Corps was Pakistan's 1st Corps, one of the most prestigious and heavily armored formations in the Pakistan Army. The 1st Corps embodied Pakistan's belief in armored decisiveness. It was built around powerful armored divisions, including the 6th Armored Division and 8th Armored Brigade, supported by infantry formations designed to hold ground and enable counterattacks. In Pakistani thinking, 1st Corps was the sword that would strike back once Indian advances were identified and fixed. Indian armored units were equipped primarily with American supplied. Pakistani armored units were equipped primarily with American supplied M47 and M48 Patton tanks. These machines had been the pride of the Pakistan Army since the early 60s, symbols of modernity and power. Their 90 guns, thick frontal armor, and advanced fire control systems were expected to dominate any battlefield encounter. Pakistan crews were well trained, confident, and imbued with a doctrine that emphasized aggressive counterattacks. The pattern wasn't meant to sit passively in defense, it was meant to surge forward, smash enemy formations, and restore the initiative. Yet this confidence carried hidden weaknesses. Pakistani armored doctrine, shaped heavily by Western concepts, made the memory of early successes placed enormous faith in decisive counterblows. It assumed that enemy advances could be halted and reversed through concentrated armored thrusts. What it underestimated that the Indian capacity to absorb this thrust, to fight decisively with armor, and to integrate infantry and artillery in ways that blunted the Patton advantages. In 1965, these weaknesses had been exported but not fully corrected. In 1971, they would be tested again under even harsher conditions. Pakistani infantry formations in First Corps was tasked primarily with holding defensive belts, protecting armored assembly areas. While brave and competent, they often lacked the same level of integration with armor that Indian units had developed. The separation of roles, tanks to attack, infantry to hold, created gaps in close coordination, especially during fluid engagements. When Pakistani tanks advanced, they sometimes did so without sufficient infantry support, leaving them vulnerable to anti tank weapons and close range threats. Command culture further distinguished the two corps. Indian command at the corps and divisional levels emphasized consultation, planning, and control executions. While this sometimes slowed decision making, it ensured that actions were coordinated and sustainable. Pakistani command culture prized boldness and initiative, and sometimes at the expense of caution. Orders emphasized counterattacks and momentum, even these conditions favored defenses. At Sakhagarh, this difference would manifest starkly when Pakistani armored units committed in unfavorable conditions in an effort to regain lost ground. Logistics and sustainment also played a decisive role. Indian 11 Corps operated closer to the supply bases with better redundancy and depth. Pakistan's First Corps, though operational on interior lines, faced constraints in moving fuel, ammunition, and replacements under Indian artillery and air pressure. Armored warfare consumes resources at an extraordinary rate. Tanks cannot be refueled or rearmed, are little more than steel coffins. Indian planners could Indian planners accounted for this reality. Pakistani planners often assumed that decisive action would end in battle before logistics became critical. By the early December of 1971, these two corps stood poised across the Sakhagarh Bulge, each confident in its strengths and blind to certain weaknesses. Indian 11th Corps believed in methodological advances, integration, and endurance. Pakistan's First Corps believed in decisive counterstroke and armored shock. The battle would soon judge which philosophy could survive the combined pressure of terrain, fire, and time.